Okay, everybody. Thank you for joining us on day 2 of our thesis reviews here at the AADRL. What we're going to be looking at today is a continuation of the design research work that's been undertaken over the last 16 months. The framework of the DRL is primarily a design research platform where, let's call it, experimentation has a home. We have people coming from pretty much all parts of the world to collectively kind of work on challenges which are, in some sense, quite large, and trying to see how design can actively somehow engage proactively in a whole host of different problems. Our current agenda has been looking at a whole host of issues, from gamification to new concepts of sustainability, climate change response, issues about mobility, flooding, issues about how gamification could potentially offer new models for participatory or community-based design. The scales of the projects are from prototypes that are one-to-one to the scale of the city. Yesterday we saw a lot of projects from Spyropoulos Studio that was working primarily on developing kind of settlement, kind of housing-based, community-based kind of gamified spaces. Patrick's studio working on large-scale kind of interventions from the master plan to the building scale, rethinking kind of collage city or beyond collage city, as what he was suggesting yesterday. Pier Andrea's studio has been working on issues of mobility, and particularly about trying to challenge the notion of finite architectures, systems that are deployable, dealing with mobility. And my studio, which is working on a subject called Elemental, which is trying to challenge the notion of phenomenon as technology, as a way to kind of deal with some forms of climate response. The way that we've organized the day is that we have 3 teams in the morning. Each team basically has an hour of discursive kind of presentation and conversation with a host of very distinguished critics that we have always feel a certain kind of humility for people to come and share the 2 days with us, because it plays a very fundamental role in terms of how we evaluate our work and kind of continue to evolve and experiment in the DRL, which, to be honest with you, is almost a quarter of a century now. And when you put it in the context of the digital, that is pretty much like, an eternity. So for us, these kind of conversational events, this kind of sharing, making this platform open and available and accessible to people is very much part of the methodology and method and practice that we feel very fortunate to actually share that with you today. I'm not going to give any more of a speech because we're already running a little bit late. But we will take an hour break for lunch, and then we will continue with 3 more projects. And we have a keynote lecture today by Thomas Heatherwick, who's been invited basically to kind of share and close basically what has been a 2-day of reviews. We made a mini site, which basically has all of our distinguished critics, synopsis and abstracts of all of the projects, both of yesterday, for those who didn't join us yesterday, and for the ones that you'll see today. It's drl.aaschool.ac.uk for those that are online, and for those here. And you get to see, I think, pretty much an overview of the kind of work we've been working on today. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the first team, and thank you guys all for your attention. Look forward to today.
Hello and good morning, everyone. We are Team Aero from Spyropoulos Studio. My name is Ipek, and my teammates Eugenio, Mattia, and Natalie. So the phenomenon that started our research is called ballooning, which is a natural behavior observed in the world of arachnids, causing these striking formations that you can see on screen. Being completely guided by environmental fields, ballooning spiders are able to take passive flight using a thread of their silk, and they can cover vast distances while doing so. Our research explores this phenomenon as a technology to fly that does not rely on the usage of fossil fuels. In addition to the idea of revisiting flight as a passive phenomenon, we are interested in the relationship between air and water. Therefore, fog catching has been one of the main focuses of our research. Water scarcity is a global challenge impacting all aspects of life on Earth. Despite the Earth being 97% water, the available fresh water is just a mere fraction. Surprisingly, the water suspended in the atmosphere is nearly double that amount. Therefore, responding to the studio brief Sustaining Life, Aero aims to find a solution in the sky, based on the idea that water is everywhere and all around us. Aero is a low-tech, deployable water harvesting infrastructure that aims to capture and distribute atmospheric fog as a reliable water resource. Our harvesting unit is composed of an air-filled volume to achieve lift using passive strategies, and a harvesting channel that condenses vapor into water droplets. And today we will be walking you through our prototypical research process. Harvesting the water in the atmosphere through a passive journey defines the scope of our project. We're interested in creating an infrastructure that is able to harvest and distribute water to be utilized for various purposes in different scenarios, locations, and terrains, especially in arid regions receiving limited precipitation. To achieve this journey in the most passive way possible, the units use thermals to lift off, the power of the sun. While in clouds, they harvest water through droplet condensation. As more water gets collected, the unit gets gradually heavier, moving down with gravity. Ultimately, the collected water is distributed, restoring the balloon to a lighter state, ready for another cycle. In an altitude between ground level to 5 kilometers, we estimate that our harvesting unit, having a diameter of 20 meters, would be able to collect 175 liters of water within a cycle of 8 hours. This is only one unit, and it's enough to sustain around 44 people for a day. Also, it's around 63% more than existing fog catchers. As our project is composed of a broad range of scales, we will be presenting our work starting from the scale of the atmosphere and gradually moving down towards the microscale of a water droplet.
Our first attempt was to try to reconstruct the atmosphere in a digital world. Multiple variables are present in the atmosphere. In terms of reducing the complexity of this big portion of air around the world, we focus on 4 initial parameters: temperature, relative humidity, wind, and thermals. By understanding cloud formations and water density, we have narrowed down the altitude range for deploying our system. Optimal conditions can be found from ground level to 5 kilometers. Utilizing real data from the US National Weather Service, we have created an atmospheric digital prototype. This allows us to simulate the behavior of the environment in a time span of 1 week, taking samples each 4 hours per day for each parameter of interest. From the digital atmospheric model, we started a digital exploration of particle systems through our considerate atmosphere. These particle behaviors allow us to study not only the masses of water that traverse the atmosphere, but also the optimal condition to harvest fog. To efficiently lift our units through the most passive and low energetic strategy, we look back on one of the forces that collaborates in the flight of ballooning spiders, which is thermal lift. In these terms, Thomas Saraceno was a source of inspiration. A relationship between rising column of air and clouds contributes to create different scenarios of potential passive soaring. The correct balance between dew point and air temperature not only produces a passive effect of lifting, but also leads to water vapor into the clouds, allowing their formations. Thermals are vertical convective columns of air naturally occurring in centrifugal patterns where the temperature at ground level is higher than the surrounding air. Moving on the atmosphere to the balloon scale, to develop an efficient, jet resilient, and low-tech airborne harvesting architecture, we persistently explore passive strategies for aerial flights. We have in particular analyzed several case studies related to aerostats, from blimps to modern applications. As Leonard Central mentioned in his book, nowadays we are so accustomed to power flight that we tend to forget that it was in balloons that men began to make aerial journeys. It was main current balloons which first conquered the air. For us, the phenomenon of thermal convection at first was addressed in our studio in the most simple manner, a simple balloon on radiators that confirmed some preconceptions. We had to go big, we had to be lightweight. After our first experiment, we explored different materials, such as polyethylene and mylar. in terms of magnifying the conservation of the heat inside the balloon to keep this flying as long as possible. As you can see here in these videos, even though the Mylar enhanced the lifting capacity, we realized that increasing the volume is necessary to make it fly.
So to increase the volume, exploring structural techniques became a necessity. We were interested in the geometry of double-shell tension compressor structures, such as the radial area, as it proves a fitting solution to accommodate our nested spherical geometry. It would also ensure the stability of the inner core under pressure or inflation. The structural concept of the unit can elegantly integrate both the air-filled enclosed volume required for lifting and the hollow channel functioning as a harvester in an easily deployable structure. Moving on with the fabrication of our 1/7 scale prototype, which you can also see over here, we started by unrolling the geometry into slices. Then we welded the slices to each other and connected the two parts with tensors. Since it's difficult to experiment with thermal lift naturally, our first experiment with flight was designed to lift an enclosed volume of air by using infrared heaters. This prototype was fully made of polyethylene, and a reflective mylar sheet was placed on the top half to trap the heat inside. Unfortunately, it ended up being heavier than we calculated, so it wasn't light enough to fly this time. So as a result, we built a second one by using only mylar. This one was around 70% lighter than the initial prototype, and also it was slightly larger in terms of volume, which resulted with a success, actually. The sudden takeoff that you will be seeing in a few seconds occurred just under 10 minutes, and it was also achieved using far less heat than our previous attempt.
Being a fixed point in the sky, the balloon is required to increase its response to the environment to maximize the absorption and conservation of the heat that keeps it flying. To do that, a responsive switchable mirror film was proposed to change between reflective to transparent, triggered by the received solar radiation. Radiative energy has become a key source for us. By harnessing solar energy and the natural radiation diffused by the planet's surface, an altitude balloon can be kept aloft up to entire weeks following a natural thermal cycle. And then comes the testing on how the climate data previously recorded could help us deploy and control our infrastructural system. In fact, we have been focused onto a simple system by trying to control the movement with least amount of cables. Testing onto the spring particle simulation set up here, we have tried to understand the control by tension. By keeping this force control anytime along the cable, we can force the movement of the balloon, still guided by the air currents, into a smaller region of the sky. When deployed on a massive scale, the control of collision gets into play along with the detection of humidity masses. This further triggers the movement along the feather lines, resulting in an aerial data-driven ballet. Further iteration with the strong wind turbulence show how these potential collision detections becomes more active. The control system was tested physically with the prototype of a spooler that works in a feedback loop between the simulated prediction weather and the actual position of the balloon, trying to optimize the capture of the most dense clouds. Here you can see how the balloon follows the best point for fog catching based on the early detection of them, belonging to, in the real world, weather prediction data.
We will now be moving within the balloon to what we are calling the core. Here we have the fog harvesting component of our unit, which will be located inside the channel of each unit. The overall design of this channel was driven by the need to allow for the most ideal conditions for fog harvesting within our balloon. Through a series of CFD studies, we were able to find that a larger opening, narrow channel, and spherical core allowed for this. Once we had the best conditions within our balloon, we then moved on to the design of a fog-catching lattice to place within. We started by experimenting with 2D patterns made of both synthetic and natural fibers to initially recreate and then try to further improve the current net patterns that are used in most fog harvesting structures today. These experiments gave us a better understanding of the direct correlation between the amount of fog that is harvested and the number of intersections in the pattern. With this knowledge, we increased the density and angles within our 2D patterns to create nets that performed approximately 60% better than the nets used today. Through further iterations, we took the best performing 2D pattern, which was 60-degree intersections at 0.3 centimeter density, and made them into 3D lattices that ended up collecting an additional 40% of the fog that they encountered. This 3D lattice was then converted to a spherical form to allow for better placement within the core of our unit by testing again different angles and densities. The lattice also needs to allow for the easy deployment of our balloon during inflation and deflation. To do this, we made a physical, manually woven 3D lattice in order to test its functionality as a deployable system for the water we aim to catch, which you can see here in these videos. These are also just some drawings and renders that help to show the lattice when it is placed within the channel of our balloon when it is inflated and deflated.
Now we're moving from the core scale to the micro scale of the droplet. Because of flight, turbulence, and temperature alterations, the retention of the collected water is a priority in our further development. Hydrogel has been added to the system as a way to store and retain the collected water from the fibrous network of the lattice. The harvesting net located inside the core of the balloon has been observed and analyzed through flexible material samples. This experiment, in particular, shows the interaction between the scaffold and the hydrogel by realizing a four-dimensional growing medium. The result created a compelling mutual response between the two materials, allowing the water dispersed through the atmosphere to attain a material shape inside the network. We moved forward by experimenting with different patterns. The initial homogeneous cell sample retained 4 times its initial weight after 8 hours of water exposure. We later tested gradient structures in order to drive the deformation into specific areas. We arranged a digital spring particle model that could replicate the hybrid response of the compound material that integrates a time-dependent growing medium that is controlled by the number of droplets that is exposed to. We tested digitally the arrangement for the cells of the lattice and their behaviors into the continuous airflow of the fog. We modeled the growth in different conditions and layering scenarios, evaluating the collection performance. The further testing showed that a very porous central area could enable airflow to pass through while creating in time a denser environment in the periphery for concentrated harvesting. We finally integrated our hybrid harvesting lattice inside the balloon's core spherical geometry. This has enabled us to digitally evaluate the effects of the turbulence field onto the whole harvesting system.
Aero's water harvesting capabilities can be used in various different ways to sustain life. The hydrogel not only stores and retains the water during the balloon's flight, but it is also able to release the water when specifically needed. To get the water from our unit, there are 2 possible ways, being either in its liquid form or within the hydrogel itself. Some possible extraction methods we have discovered is that the water can be released by the addition of natural ionic compounds. This video here shows the hydrogel being released with the addition of salt. Another option for release is depending on environmental conditions. This video, done by researchers at the University of Texas, shows a new type of hydrogel that releases the water when it hits 32 degrees Celsius. This is suitable for us because it absorbs in the colder temperature of the atmosphere and releases when on the ground in the hotter temperature. Using these forms of water extraction, there are 2 main scenarios for our unit that share a strategy based on the hydrogel as a storage medium. In one scenario, the extraction of the hydrogel itself becomes an option through accessibility directly to the balloon core. In another scenario, the usage of thermally responsive hydrogel can bring water easily back to its fluid state, which can be used as a rapid source of water if required. With the possibility of the hydrogel being extracted, it can then be planted along with seeds to allow for a steady release of water to help with the irrigation of crops and ensuring food security. We have tested this example as a growing medium or a soil enhancement, as you can see here with the hydrogel plants growing almost 2 times more than the plants without it. This scenario can allow for the sustainable cultivation of farms and fresh crops in otherwise arid and barren regions that are currently facing water scarcities.
In addressing water scarcity on a global level, our system benefits from the fact that a wide part of the sites on the planet that are facing this challenge are usually very favorable areas to find thermals, and thus making use of passive storing energy. We describe our location-based strategy by selecting 5 reference physical and geometrical parameters. These characterize specific conditions related to the site that can affect and optimize the balloon's positioning strategy. The first 2 parameters above are based on vector directionality, specifically humid air current orientation and sun directionality. In the first case, the anchoring of the balloon is simply positioned towards the wind direction to optimize collection. In the second, the positioning of the anchors follows the thermals to gain lift. The third strategy regards the location of the balloons in the vicinity of pre-existing distributing networks on site, such as canals and dried riverbeds. Below, 2 strategies that engage with slope. Firstly, by avoiding the downwind side of slope in order to avoid mechanical turbulence. Secondly, through a water drainage simulation that informs the location of the unit so to design a low-tech distribution system of the collected water on land. Finally, we define 3 prototypical terrain types, each incorporating different components from the previous parameters that you've seen. The coastal terrain is denoted by low sea fog and a very pronounced wind directionality. Then a sloped terrain, where turbulence and anchoring are key elements. And a desertic terrain that is characterized by a very high solar power available for flight, up to high altitude clouds. Summarizing the strategy onto this specific terrain, firstly, a local wind analysis informs the selection of a base grid. The directional analysis is run, filtering the possible anchoring points. Then the feathering system is simulated in response to the predicted humidity field, showing a time-based evaluation of the optimal position for collection, here highlighted in blue. And in the last simulation, finally, the passive drainage is visualized to inform the large-scale distribution of water. And this concludes our overview of Aero. Thank you so much for your time. So I'll drive you quickly through the models. Here, as we said, our biggest prototype that is on scale 1 to 7 and shows like our improvements in fabrication. We started from very small and basic prototypes, leading finally to this one that shows this tension compression system that allows the core inside to keep its shape. And we have also rough version of our lattice inside. That is then defined more into this model here that integrates the hydrogel and shows how the 2 materials work together in this compound system. In this tank here instead, I apologize with Theo before for interrupting his speech with the motor going up and down. The mechanism here is sensing the humidity level, so bringing our balloon up and down and simulating our life cycle. On the panels, as you've seen, we're kind of going through our scale from the atmospherical planetary scale up to the droplets, and finally our terrain studies. And in the models here, we have our first test samples onto 2D patterns, starting from the fog catching net that is usually nowadays utilized for very passive strategies, and then leading to our improved versions, and moving forward to 3D lattices that have been also 3D printed with flexible materials to understand the reaction of the lattice with the hydrogel in its growing in time. Here you can see some models of the double shell structure that we use to understand also the ratio between the outer shell and the inner shell of the core, and the tension that keeps the shape together under inflation. This is our manually woven lattice that we've used, as you've seen in the video, to understand the behavior under inflation. Our machine for the understanding of movement and the reaction to in real time to the noise field of humidity. Finally, a visualization of our terrain. Here, sort of merging together our 3 prototypical sites, the coastal one where the balloons can fly very close to the terrain because of this humidity fog coming from the sea, then our desert and our sloped version. And on the panel below, you can see our range of action and indicated also the turbulence fields. And finally, in this tank here, you can see in section how the hydrogel is helping the growth of this cress. In 5 days, this has been the result so far. And yeah, getting closer, you can see how the hydrogel is kind of retaining humidity in time. Thank you so much.
Hello. Yeah, congratulations. I think your process was so clear and legible. That was very interesting for us to watch. The only thing that I'm slightly worried about is the cabling. I'm just thinking of like if it becomes an obstacle for drones, birds, airplanes. And I was thinking if you thought of like a wire-free system, I was thinking of something like Annika Yi's system of controlling the swarm. And then it becomes an entire, I don't know, I think might be an interesting thing for you to think of, because the length of the cable and all those other issues then becomes such an important aspect of the project that I don't see why it should become such a huge issue.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. One word I think describes your work is richness. You have developed, apart from a fantastic video that you were able to present following step by step, but I think the richness that you have shown us this morning, it goes from the digital elaboration. I mean, you managed to you recreate the environment of our atmosphere, to the richness of the model making, the physical exploration. And I like the fact that in that you went through, the simplest of ever experiment of the balloon over the heater here at the school, all the way to testing at different scale what was happening. I think that gives a very, again, rich result when it comes to a full understanding of what your system is doing at different scale. One item that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about is whether this shape of the sphere was actually the only one explored. At the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about gliders or different shape of inflatable, and whether at one point you thought, okay, yes, find the sphere, is moving around freely, works very well with thermal and the idea of having a core. But was there at one point, a discussion internally whether different types of structure and could have give you a different result?
I can reply to both the question, also Carlos' question, because I think they're related. Yes, there was a time, actually quite long, where we discussed with Theo and with the studio in general different shapes for the balloons and also feathering systems. Especially we had some sort of simulations that we made very basic tests about the shape, but at the end I think we decided to focus on this shape, and also it took a long time to figure out the integration of the lattice within it. So I think the spherical shape was also a way for us to kind of strategize our process in a simpler way at that point. We figured out before in some tests, again, different shapes of the balloon, but we decided to move forward with this, and also for the sake of our, let's say, story and process, we kind of, kept this spherical shape. But yes, for sure, we thought about different methods. And about the feathering, we also thought at first of just flying a balloon and having some other forms of actuation and control. But I think what we really wanted to do was, with Theo in the discussion, was to keep this project as passive and low-tech as possible, and also very easily deployable, so that in case it could be very easy with just a motor and a tether to actuate it, even without a very deep technical knowledge. So yes, I think.
I can also add something to the sphere question. At first, we were also fabricating geometry similar to what Saraceno did in the Aéro scene, more triangular ones, because it was easier to fabricate that geometry. But in the end, we realized that the geometry that will actually maximize our volume is eventually the sphere with a limited amount of material and weight. So that was also one of the decisions.
There's a very poetic impulse, I think, at the heart of the project, which is this idea of taking the natural process of nucleation, which is at the sort of center of rain, and then beginning to think about that as the core of a geometry. You're basically creating these super droplets, which I think is actually quite poetic. You're turning the sky into this sort of suspended colloid. There's a lot of things that I appreciate very much about the project. I think one of the things that I appreciate most is actually the way in which there's a kind of cascading series of decisions around necessary geometries that occur at sort of every embedded scale of the project. And so, in particular, I was really compelled by this idea that, okay, at a certain point you have to think about how this matrix collapses and then expands, and so that induces certain kinds of constraints on the lattice geometry that can be deployed within it. If anything, there was a moment in the presentation when you had these almost chronophotographs or sort of motion studies of the turbulent behavior of the balloons in the air. You were mapping the traces of those. I think there's a way in some of these sort of geometric studies that you could use those kinds of empirical traces as an active motivator for the selection of your final geometries. So as rigorous as the process is, I think there's an opportunity for greater precision still. And that's no criticism. I think it's fabulous what you've done. It's just a suggestion for how to amplify or intensify some of those fantastic qualities. And I love this idea that there could be an active skin to this balloon, that actually it could be something that's sort of quasi-autonomous. That's something that in terms of control mechanism, I think it's very modern. I mean, there's very classical things, very sort of historical things that ghosts of Montgolfier and things like this sort of floating through the project. But that's something which is extremely contemporary, and I'd be very curious to see how that could be taken further. Two, I guess, questions. Maybe also to build on this sort of a thread around the geometry. I do wonder if I think for all sorts of pragmatic and sort of logical reasons, in terms of sort of volume maximization and things like this, the sphere makes some sense. But I do wonder if there's some way to almost apply a kind of fractal logic. You have this sort of core. This is the tokamat core, which is hollowed out for the sort of moisture catching. Is it possible to actually add a series of additional cores? Because obviously the efficacy of this is dependent on the volume of those cores, not necessarily the volume of the balloon itself. And then I think there's a question about how these things are initially launched and anchored, and the kind of infrastructure that occurs at the ground level. And we see people sort of like harvesting, and I was sort of beguiled by this idea that maybe you could squeeze it out and get all of the water that's been absorbed. But what is the kind of like, what is the human organizational and technical infrastructure on the ground level that enables all of this? It's light, to be sure, there's not much, but there has to be something. And I feel like that's also a part of this systems architecture. I was curious your thoughts actually on that.
No, briefly, about the core strategy that you were asking about, I think that, yeah, definitely it would have been interesting to explore multiple cores. I think we thought also about it, but we found that it could have make complicated than figuring out the mass of the balloon and how it would react by changing its gravity point, basically. So again, we tried to keep it simple, so to understand in the most simple way the reaction of one balloon and one core. Also for the CFD analysis, kind of helped us to understand very clearly. And I think adding more cores for sure will be a step forward. But yeah, and the same for the strategy on land. We certainly thought about it, but we found that in this stage of the project on itself, which is more focused, as you've seen, much part of it is focused on the detailed scale of the droplet and the hydrogel. We found that that part on land was something that we, as you've seen, we strategized more conceptually. But yeah, for sure it would be an interesting step forward, I would say. Yeah.
I think one other sort of maybe concern that I might have is the water's not coming from nowhere. You're extracting it actually from a hydrologic cycle, and as you begin to build this up, you have the same kind of secondary impacts that you would have from any kind of like farming process. And so in effect, you're sort of like desiccating the air, which is going to have collateral impacts on all the area around. And so that's, I think, one question is like, especially in sort of arid climates, you're leading to, this could potentially amplify or accelerate certain aspects of desertification. I was curious if you had thoughts on that.
Well, honestly, I think it depends a lot on the scale of the project, how it would be actually actuated. And as you've seen, we kind of worked on thinking about ranges of deployment, not really going into specific numbers into that part. So surely, I think, since we know how much a balloon would harvest and its life cycle, I think that it would be a matter of calculation and evaluation based on very specific setups. But again, towards the end of the project, as you've seen, we tried to keep it more prototypical and more broad in the range of perspective. And then in case there would be a system that, based on site, would be evaluated specifically, I guess.
Okay, thank you guys. So beautiful. All of it is magical. Thank you. It's like you took us to another world. And I think so much of the beauty of what you've done sits in the idea of the concept of it and the visualization and the presentation. And I don't want to go too far outside into context and numbers because that's not necessarily the purpose of what you're sharing. But I think context matters, and so you have the very, the detailed design, architectural structure, material, and then you have these terrains. But I do think to understand the technology, to explain or to share at some point, who else is doing this? You mentioned Saraceno, but in terms of fog harvesting, what does that mean? What are the implications of it? Who else is doing it? What is the scale at which you want to operate? How many of these balloons would you be considering? How many plastic balloons do we need in the world kind of like scattered around to capture what amount of water? I think that would really help to take this from being something that feels very hopeful and crafted in the most incredible way to being something that has a meaning that takes your work and your practice using technology to another layer. And the second thing I wanted to add is this is how beautifully and seamlessly you use data to showcase, again, context in terms of terrain, harvesting, material design. And so if you could take that forward to considering impact and you maybe, pick a side, pick a pilot project, it's less evocative, but it would help to give it a depth and a breadth that I think is not there yet. Thank you.
I subscribe to everything you said. I mean, it's a really fantastic project. And I think I would find it credible as a blue sky kind of projection that such a system is like a new infrastructure which could be deployed to scale. And for that, it's important that it's precise, that it's graceful, that it's light, that it is beautiful. And I can compare the way kind of wind turbine are kind of populating the seas and the land formations, and they also get resistance just because they transform in a way which are negative. They're noisy, and also they're seen as visual pollution. So in that sense, some of that gracefulness and beauty is quite important. But then also at the same time, this question of tethering and what that might do is another question. And I think there are versions of this similar project, I think 2 or 3 years ago, where you had untethered balloons with little propellers, and you could have solar energy where they become more autonomous. So these things are still in the range. But I think the project I find quite convincing compared to solar farms and wind farms, or even older infrastructures which cover the earth, which are sometimes you find it beautiful, sometimes maybe not, like the electric grid with these overland kind of cables running through mountains and everything. So it competes with this, but in a very contemporary 21st century way. And for that, I think I congratulate you. I find it's very rigorous. It's how far you can go with your research and comparative research, including, some of the simulations, one would have to integrate these simulations. Whether they realistic at this point, we don't know in terms of the droplets. But I think what is great about the project, the precision and elegance of all these models, all these visualizations and so on, brings that home. And I think that aesthetic quality also brings kind of trust into precision and command over this. And I come to this because I have one thing to criticize, which is somehow this net. This net doesn't live up to this. I can't trust it. It doesn't feel, real, and has loops and so on. So I urge you to make this superbly beautiful, which is, when it actually will work, it will be. So, but congratulations on a fantastic project. I see something like this happening.
I'm really happy to second all of that. I might disagree on this net, because I think sometimes a little imperfection on the table actually reveals the beauty of everything else. And there's kind of mistakes in the process, I'm sure. One of which I'm kind of wondering what happened to that balloon that launched so successfully, but that's we can talk about that later. I wanted to pick up on this idea of context as a way of asking a couple of questions. I've been interested all week in looking at the way in which these kind of research-orientated postgraduate programs define the scope of a thesis. You're never going to do everything. So the question of where you define that context becomes very specific. And I think also picking up on ideas that you're simulating a kind of a weather event. But the amazing thing about weather is it is kind of cosmological. It responds to the entirety of the sphere of the globe. And then you're producing a static weather event. And then, yes, indeed, the way in which you may desiccate other parts of the globe becomes this very particular relationship between the two phenomena, which could be the last stage of that project, which then leads to the question of scale. So you have these different climates, you have these different contexts, and whether these spheres, and particularly the cores, would need to adapt over time. And I think that's where it starts to become very interesting, and that's where it becomes provocative. And I like the provocation, because as much as we may be designing a system that solves problems, actually the provocation obviously calls attention to the issues that are live at the moment. The other very minor point is I was curious about things like the core and the air pressure question and why it's symmetrical, because one would assume that you have wind direction and that you would produce a degree of pressure differential that would be beneficial. I don't know if that was part of the consideration. Very specific question with a general comment.
I mean, the reason it's symmetrical is actually to neutralize the pressure, actually, because if one side is larger and the other is smaller, then it kind of creates destabilize it and creates turbulence also. So the pressure was actually needed to maintain it being stable in the turbulence and in the wind. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks so much.
I also want to applaud you for the project. It's, I mean, you did amazing work in terms of the research, how you use technology and lead us through the whole process, your thinking process. I really love the images. I think they're very strong and show clearly your vision of the future. And it's a very relevant topic. If I would say anything is, and push you to do more researches, I'm questioning the relationship between the skin and the inner funnel. I mean, right now I understand it's just for flying, but I'm questioning, could it also be for instance, cooling the water particles to make them more compact in a way? Or is there a more relationship between the outer skin and the inner to optimize what's happening inside the funnel? Or are these particles also, could they be preventing overheating of the Earth? I think there's a lot more we could pack into, and maybe that gives you just some more thoughts for doing more research. But I think it's a really nice project and very refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, sorry. First, I want to say that was incredible. I can't believe you did so much in such a small period of time. And you guys are a group of architects, and this is hypothetical, so I don't think it's fair for us to ask you such detailed questions when you've had to do this in such a short amount of time. I feel very lucky that we have young, bright people like you to show people ideas of what could be. And my dad worked for NASA for 40 years, and he used to have to think of these hypothetical things. He was telling me in the 80s he was landing the shuttle with a laser before autonomous driving. So I don't think this is like outside of reality. I think we need people like you to really think of these incredible ideas. So this is just something stupidly practical. I make a lot of these structures, but for aesthetic reasons. Like, they're nowhere nearly as like technologically amazing as this. And one issue we have a lot is actually just the slightest amount of wind makes all the cords tangle. And even this model is like toggled at two ends. So the density has to be like almost like, they have to be miles apart. And even so, like a lot of the balloons would literally be blowing on the ground and just wondering, that's just really stupid practical. But I think overall, it's not really to question like the microcosm of like, how is this gonna work? You had how many months to pull this amount together? I think the idea is incredible. And I feel lucky that Patrick asked me to come because.
But they know the tanking issue.
Oh yeah? Yeah, it's super practical. That's fine. The thing is, we don't need an answer. It's not important. I feel like the presentation as a whole, I almost wish we could push you to NASA or another organization to then, no, I'm serious, like figure out like how do you create the practicalities, because you actually proved it through this hydro plant thing. I can't even believe they proved it. I mean, that's incredible. Like, that's amazing. So I just want to congratulate you on that. And even in NASA, when something fails, it's because they incorrectly calculated the metrics to, imperial. It was something so stupid and practical. And so that's why I was bringing up the chords, But anyways, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, I would like also to congratulate you. It's very beautiful, it's very well thought through and very well presented. And all the drawings and the models and what you show and what also you said, it was extremely precise and consistent, so thank you for that. I would like just to return to some of the comments which concern with the context, and I know that it's more of, here we are to experiment and to explore ideas, and I would second what has already been said, but I guess as a next step, and based on what you said, that is to evaluate the performance, right? And actually it's very important to understand how materials relate, and also how what the system you are proposing relates to environments, or how it works with, interacts with environment. I think that could be the next step in more pragmatic in one-way terms, because yes, the system is prototypical, but you talked about 3 prototypical terrains, right? But the terrains are not prototypical. I mean, we may use the massage, we may describe the massage for the sake of the experiment, but I think as a next step, it would be very interesting to see, because I think it's extremely topical, and it can be extremely valuable as a proposition, right? Because it is an idea, and you explore within that space and within that period of time the idea. But I think it could be extremely valuable. And there are certain things that have the scale of the deployment, right? Or the more specific strategies of the deployment in specific environments, right? In specific terrains. That's what I would say more, and I say it's more as what could be the next, a way to take it further. But for what we have now and for the time being, I think it's only to congratulate you. Thank you.
And I think a lot of the comments are very thoughtful, and I think seeds for the students to consider and to see how they can move forward. I think that there are certain aspects of the project that I appreciate, which is its simplicity to address challenges which are planetary, and scalability is always talked about, even in more entrepreneurial ways. So this fast, cheap, survivalist infrastructure for me is very relevant, but also not just an idea. I think if we separate the so-called conceptual poetic from the technical, and obviously the challenges of what we're dealing with from a planetary and climate point of view, if you consider this from the point of view of a water infrastructure and how we deal with that, with hard surfaces and fixed infrastructure that can never really adjust to anything, if a solution can be considered through these kind of tethered balloon systems, a lot is gained. So I think one way to make the, let's say, next step of the conversation is, I think, to pick up on Suhair's point, to be a little bit more hardcore about, like, this is existing water harvest systems and this is what they can do. And it's not made explicit in your presentation. It's implicit if you want to look at it. You have the quantification, the volumes. You could have shown these kind of fabric-based systems that people are deploying and what they do. The tethering, I think, is an important part because in some sense it just basically removes any kind of high-tech managing system. If I look at this model and interpret it slightly different, 3 tethering points will self-regulate and control this. If we have really high winds, you just use these kind of fishing line things. It can be a completely self-regulating system based on all of the data and the weather systems that are really out there in the world. So in one way, the low-tech manifestation of it is compensated by a very high-tech, data-driven way of dealing with this. I think the scenarios about context also is important. One could read your project in terms of context only from the degree of atmosphere. That the idea of what we think about as ground is actually something very, very different. The question about how people access it, though, I think brings that in a very different domain. So one thing is actually extracting it, and then is where I think the architecture comes into it, which is the deployability, the organization, all of those kind of things that allows people to actually access it outside of just like, you know, a desalination plant or other versions of this, I think is important because it humanizes it. And because it humanizes it means that this could just be a document that you send to people in a very low-tech way, in a flat-packed thing that people can do it yourself. I mean, Saraceno has those intentions, but he doesn't have, let's say, the same kind of technological desire or apparatus to actually work through some of those problems. So I think Dara mentioned NASA and other places. Of course, these kind of prototypical lived experiments are taken very seriously. And I think what's interesting is, like, what are you going to do next? These ideas can live here, die here, or just be put on a shelf. Or you can say, you know, I believe in this idea, and I think that this idea in a super low-tech way has legs. People don't have competing solutions, I can tell you that, without too much bias because I was their studio tutor. And I think the reality of that stuff is that I think you can make an argument to bring on board people to help you help other people. And I think, the lecture tonight is supposed to be titled around the book Humanize. And I think the attempts of projects like this is also a different way of considering that, right? So this isn't an urban project in a traditional sense, but it is an infrastructure project. And you've made some, I think, very important relationships with where water needs to be, and that relationship of temperature differential, a simple balloon, and hydrogel, which, to be honest with you, you should make a lot more of this model, which is not just about growing some stuff. It's the fact that you can start to deal with some of that desertification, create different levels of actually using the water to basically change and address the ground and start to create something that's maybe more sustainable for the people that are regionally there. So I think as these things are happening, I think the more that you can become specific to those scenarios and not default to its prototypical. It's prototypical so that it has reach, but then it has to be very context specific in terms of how it takes that data and manifests that for the conditions and for who this is for. So I'm very positive about where the project has got, mostly because you've been very restrained not to make something just out of a shape. Even if I like spheres, it becomes a kind of ongoing joke in my studio. But I think the desire for you to actually deliver performative relational aspects, I think, is clear. I don't think that this is just a tech performative project. And that's why I think some of the discussions about the elegance of this, all of that stuff has to be part of it. People are going to live with this, maybe, hopefully. Then the question is how? Is it reusable? The materials that are being used, what's the life cycle of all of that stuff? You can be ruthless about all of these aspects, and I think you're well positioned to be able to offer a kind of positive contribution to this. So I commend you and thank you for the project. We're going to continue with the next one. And we got another 5 to go for today, so the conversation will continue. Thanks so much. Phase ones, can you guys help the cause, grab some models, bring it to the studio, and we can continue.